The night I was turned away from my own son's wedding began like any other proud father's evening. I left my house in Atlanta just before 6, wearing a charcoal suit I'd had tailored for the occasion. In my inside pocket, I carried a check for $25,000, a gift for my son Daniel and his bride Lila. I remember checking the mirror before I left, straightening my tie, and whispering to myself that this would be the happiest day of his life. I had no idea it would become the most humiliating night of mine. The rain had started softly when I arrived at the Palmetto Grand Ballroom. The building glowed under silver light, every window alive with movement and laughter. For a moment I stood in the parking lot, breathing in the scent of wet asphalt and magnolia, thinking how proud my late wife would have been to see Daniel marry. Then I walked toward the main entrance, heart steady, smile ready. 2 security guards stood by the door. Large men in black suits, earpieces glinting under the chandeliers. I nodded politely and reached for my invitation, but before I could speak, one of them held up a phone. On the screen was my face, a recent photo pulled from my social media. Beneath it, bold red text read, "Do not admit." For a moment, I thought it was a joke. I even laughed a short, nervous sound that didn't fit the air. "There must be a mistake," I told them. "I'm the groom's father." The taller guard looked at me with rehearsed authority. "Sir, we have explicit instructions. If this man attempts to enter, escort him off the premises immediately." My mouth went dry. "Instructions from who?" He didn't blink. "From Mr. Daniel Miles himself, sir." It felt like the floor tilted beneath me. My own son, my only son, had ordered his father to be barred from his wedding. I tried to steady my voice. "You can't be serious." "Let me call him." When I reached for my phone, the second guard stepped forward, arm out like a barrier. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to step aside." Rain began to fall harder. Guests arrived, one after another, elegant couples, holding umbrellas, flashing smiles. I recognized faces, cousins, colleagues, friends who had dined in my home. Some avoided my eyes, others pretended not to see me. No one stopped. Then I saw her, Elaine, my ex-wife, arriving arm in arm with her sister. She glanced at me for a fraction of a second, her expression unreadable, then turned away and walked past the guards without a word. They greeted her with courtesy. No hesitation. "Elaine," I called out. "Elaine, please." She didn't turn. The music inside swelled, muffled but clear, a celebration I was now exiled from. I spotted my daughter Anna stepping out of a car with her husband. For a heartbeat, hope returned. "Anna," I shouted over the rain. She froze, eyes wide, when she saw me, but before she could move, her husband whispered something to her and guided her quickly inside. My voice cracked. "Anna, please." The younger guard frowned. "Sir, you're causing a scene." "A scene?" I repeated the words, tasting bitter. "I paid for his education, for his first car, for every chance he ever had, and you call this a scene?" The guard's jaw tightened. "Sir, we'll have to escort you out." They surrounded me, 2 on each side, moving with professional calm, as if I were some intruder. The guests watched. Some whispered. Some lifted their phones to record. I walked through that rain like a ghost, dignity hanging by a thread. When we reached my car, one guard opened the door and said, "Please leave the property immediately, Mr. Miles. If you return, we'll contact the police." I got in without a word. My hands were shaking. The rain drummed against the windshield in relentless rhythm. But inside the car, there was only silence. The kind that cracks something deep inside you. I sat there for a long time, watching headlights glide across puddles, listening to the echo of distant laughter from inside the ballroom. My son was dancing. Toasts were being made. And I was sitting outside like a criminal. I should have cried. I didn't. Instead, something colder settled in, a kind of crystal clarity. I reached for my phone and opened the voice recorder. My voice came out calm, almost detached. April 17th, 2024. 6:32 p.m. I've just been physically removed from my son Daniel Miles's wedding by 4 security guards under his explicit orders. Witnesses include my ex-wife, my daughter, and numerous relatives. None intervened. I stopped the recording and saved it. Then I took out my camera and photographed the entrance, the guards, the glowing windows behind them. Documentation, evidence. I didn't know of what yet, but my instincts told me it mattered. The guards finally turned back inside. I remained engine off, rain fogging the windows. In that isolation, memory began to replay the last few months, every missed call, every awkward pause, every excuse Daniel had made about wedding plans I was too busy to understand. It all started 8 months earlier when he first mentioned Lila. He'd told me he met her by accident, a spilled coffee, a laugh, a spark. At the time, I'd smiled, thinking it was fate. Now, sitting in the dark with rain sliding down the glass, I saw the pattern for what it was. Precision. A design. I thought back to that dinner in October, the first time I met her. She was beautiful, elegant, polished, just the right mix of charm and mystery. I'd wanted to like her, and I did at first. But there had been something rehearsed about her curiosity, her compliments too well placed, as if she already knew what impressed me. Now the pieces aligned like teeth on a gear. I pressed the recording button again. "If I'm right," I said quietly, "this isn't about love. It's about inheritance." The sound of my own voice steadied me. I'd built my company Miles Imports from the ground up. I'd survived recessions, betrayals, market collapses. I knew what patterns looked like, and I could sense when I was being maneuvered. Through the blur of the rain, I saw silhouettes dancing inside flashes of color and light. The celebration I had funded, planned to attend, and been erased from. I leaned back, eyes open, but distant. The pain didn't feel sharp anymore. It felt purposeful. That night, I didn't drive home immediately. I waited until the music faded and the laughter thinned, and I made a decision that would change everything that followed. I whispered to the empty car, "You built this on deceit, Daniel. But I built my life on precision, and I never lose to my own creation." Then I started the engine and drove off into the rain. The echo of betrayal fading behind me, but the beginning of something far stronger rising inside. The rain had stopped by the time I reached home, but the storm inside me hadn't. The driveway lights glowed softly across the wet gravel as I pulled in, engine humming low. My house stood silent and still, as if it too were waiting for an explanation. I sat there in the car for a full minute, hands still on the wheel, trying to decide whether to scream or laugh. Neither came. Instead, I turned off the ignition and listened to the slow tick of the cooling engine. The silence was heavier than anger. It was understanding. When I finally stepped out, the night air hit me with the scent of wet pine. The porch light flickered faintly as I unlocked the door and entered. The familiar smell of cedar polish and old books greeted me, grounding me in the one place that was still mine. I walked straight to my study, the room where every major decision of my life had been made. The desk was tidy as I'd left it, bills stacked neatly, a family photo in a silver frame beside my monitor. The photo stopped me in my tracks. It was from Christmas 2 years ago. Daniel, Anna, and me standing in front of the tree, smiling like a family that believed the world was still whole. Lila wasn't in that picture. I stared at it until my reflection blurred against the glass. I set the photo face down. Then I unlocked the drawer beneath the desk and took out my leather notebook, the one where I kept notes on projects, investments, and lately instincts. The page I turned to was dated September 2023. The handwriting was sharp and patient. Daniel distracted. Cancels dinners. New girlfriend Lila. Charming but evasive. At the time it had meant nothing. I'd written it the way an architect sketches a line without knowing it will later hold the whole structure. Now reading it, I felt the weight of prophecy. I opened my laptop and began scrolling through my email archives, tracing the months before the wedding, like a forensic pathologist examining a body. Every message from Daniel told a story. If I read between the lines, shorter replies, fewer calls, postponed lunches. He was pulling away one thread at a time, politely, methodically. Around midnight, I poured myself a drink. Bourbon. No ice. The kind of burn that reminds you you're still alive. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. There was one thing about me that Elaine, my ex-wife, always hated. I couldn't let confusion live in my house. When something didn't make sense, I tore it apart until it did. That trait had built my business and destroyed my marriage. And now, it was awake again. By 2 a.m., I had a plan forming rough and skeletal, but breathing. I wasn't going to storm into Daniel's life demanding answers. I'd done that before with employees, and it always drove them further away. No. This required patience, observation, a surgeon's hand, not a hammer's. The first step was information. I opened my contacts and scrolled to Levante Investigations. The agency had handled corporate background checks for my company before quietly, legally, efficiently. I typed a message, need discreet personal investigation. Possible financial manipulation involving family members. Begin preliminary check on Lila Carver and Elaine Miles. Confidential. I hesitated before pressing send. For a split second, guilt flickered. What kind of father hires investigators to examine his own son's fiancée? But that flicker died quickly. Trust isn't blind. It's earned. The message sent. The next morning, sunlight poured through the blinds, mocking the night's resolve. I made coffee and stood in the kitchen, staring at the backyard where Daniel had once built a treehouse with me. He was 10, and the nails had been crooked, the boards uneven. But he'd called it our fortress. I remembered his laugh echoing through the summer air. The sound came back to me now, painful in its purity. I whispered, "What happened to us?" The phone rang, slicing through the quiet. I answered. Mr. Miles, came a familiar voice. It was Gordon Hale, my attorney and friend for nearly 2 decades. I read your message. Levante copied me in. You sure you want to do this? Yes, I said simply. There was a pause. You think your son's involved? I think he's asleep in a house someone else built for him. I need to know who the architect is. Gordon exhaled slowly. All right, I'll coordinate. You'll have a preliminary report within a week. Make it 3 days. He didn't argue. He knew me too well. When the call ended, I went upstairs to shower. The mirror fogged quickly. But my reflection still stared back through the steam, an older man lined with years of patience and the kind of exhaustion only family can cause. By afternoon, I forced myself into routine. Meetings, emails, contracts. The mask of normalcy. No one at the office suspected that while I discussed import quotas and shipping schedules, I was replaying every look Lila had given me over dinner, every subtle pause when Elaine spoke her name. At 6 p.m., I was about to leave the office when my phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. Preliminary data incoming, proceeding with deeper verification. Attached was a small PDF, a snapshot, not yet the full picture, but enough to freeze me mid-step. Lila Carver, no property listed in her name, inconsistent employment history, 3 recent bank deposits totaling $42,000, all from an account linked to Wells Consulting, Elaine's company. My heart slowed. Then it steadied. I closed the file, locked my phone, and turned off the lights. When I drove home that night, the city lights blurred past like ghosts. My mind wasn't on traffic or noise. It was mapping connections, motives, opportunities. If Elaine was funding Lila, there was a reason. And if Daniel didn't know, he was already their pawn. That thought didn't break me. It focused me. I had built an empire by recognizing patterns invisible to others. This was no different. Only the stakes had changed. Back home, I poured another bourbon and stood by the window. The magnolia trees swayed in the night breeze, and for the first time, I didn't feel humiliated. I felt awake. I took out my notebook again and wrote Phase 1 information. Phase 2, preparation. Phase 3, reversal. I underlined the last word twice. Then I closed the book and whispered into the quiet. You wanted to lock me out, Daniel. But you forgot who designed the doors. That night, I slept for the first time in 3 days. Not because I was at peace, but because my plan finally had breath. 3 days later, the report from Levante Investigations arrived. It came in a plain envelope, no company logo, just my name written in tidy block letters. I sat at the kitchen table staring at it for a long time, my coffee untouched, steam fading into the morning light. I'd opened countless confidential files over 40 years in business, some revealing fraud, others betrayal, but never one that had the potential to destroy my own family. When I finally slid it open, the paper made a small sound like the start of a confession. Inside were printed pages and several photographs. The first page was a summary, direct and professional subject, Lila Carver. Connection established with Elaine Miles, formerly Wells Consulting. Evidence of prior contact dating back to February 2022. I froze. That was more than a year before Daniel's supposed chance encounter at the coffee shop. I turned the page. There were photos Lila and Elaine having lunch together at a restaurant in Midtown Atlanta. Another, the two entering an office building on Peachtree Street, time-stamped June 2022. A third, this one hit hardest, showed them leaving a notary's office together, both smiling, faintly unaware of the camera that caught them. My breath caught. The report continued, 32 phone calls documented between April and July 2022. Average duration 16 minutes. Content unavailable. Financial link $15,000 transfer from Wells Consulting to Carver Design, non-existent entity on June 10, 2022. I read the line twice. Carver Design. A company that didn't exist except on paper. Elaine had built a shell company to funnel money to Lila. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned to the final page. It listed additional observations, written in the investigator's clipped, neutral tone. Subject Lila Carver appears to have limited independent financial resources. Clothing, jewelry, and transportation exceed known income. Likely funded by secondary source, see previous. Behavioral notes calculated, charm, high emotional intelligence, observed pattern of intentional proximity to subject Daniel Miles in August 2023. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the wall. My first instinct wasn't rage. It was disbelief at how neatly everything fit, every canceled lunch, every change in Daniel's tone, every small withdrawal I'd ignored. Elaine hadn't simply wanted revenge. She'd wanted control. She'd found a way to infiltrate my son's life through someone he thought he'd chosen himself. For a long time, I didn't move. The clock ticked softly in the background, the only witness to my silence. Then I gathered the papers and locked them in the safe behind my study bookshelf. At noon, I called Gordon. He answered on the second ring. "I've read the report," I said. He didn't ask for details. He already knew what that meant. "How bad engineered?" I replied. "She recruited Lila over a year before they met. Used Wells Consulting to transfer funds under a false company name. My ex-wife is playing chess, not checkers." Gordon exhaled. "Then you'll need a counter strategy," I'm not going to yell or confront. I'll build something stronger than what she's trying to take. Quietly. He was silent for a moment. I'll start drafting whatever documents you need. Asset protection, trust adjustments, updated will. We'll move fast. Good, I said, but not yet. Timing will matter. I want everything ready but invisible. That evening, I poured myself another drink and sat outside on the back porch. The magnolia trees swayed under a soft breeze, their petals scattering across the grass. The world looked normal again, but nothing was normal anymore. As the sun went down, memories began to replay conversations with Elaine that had seemed meaningless at the time, but now cut like glass. Daniel needs independence, Howard, she'd said once, her tone sweet but edged with something else. He can't always rely on you. Maybe if you learned to step back, he'd step forward. Now I saw what that really meant. She wanted me to step away so she could step in. I whispered to the fading light. You should have stayed out of my world, Elaine. I was kind enough to walk away once. You won't get that twice. Later that night, I opened my notebook and began to outline the next phase. Phase 2. Preparation, secure legal foundation, rewrite my will and company structure. Identify allies. Only 2 names came to mind. Gordon Hale, my attorney, and Dax Evans, my oldest friend and former business partner. Stay silent. Let them believe I'm unaware. Silence would be my camouflage. I closed the notebook. My hands had stopped shaking. The fear had turned into focus. The following morning, I called Dax. He answered with his usual, unpolished warmth. Howard, it's been too long. What's going on? I hesitated. I need your advice. Confidential. Can you come by tonight? Of course, he said without hesitation. What's this about family? I replied simply. And the price of trust. He didn't ask more. That's why I'd chosen him. When evening came, Dax arrived with his usual easy presence, jeans, a loose shirt, the kind of man who never needed to impress anyone. But when he saw my face, his expression changed. This isn't business, is it? He asked. No, I said quietly. It's worse. We sat in the study while I poured 2 glasses of brandy. I told him everything, the guards at the wedding, the investigation, the photographs. His hands tightened around the glass jaw, clenched. Jesus, Howard. That's premeditated manipulation. You can't just let it slide. I don't intend to, I said. But I won't fight it their way. I've spent my life building things people thought I couldn't. This will be no different. What's your next step? I opened the safe and laid out the folder in front of him. Documentation. If they wanted to use deception as foundation, I'll use truth as architecture. Dax skimmed through the pages, his expression darkening. This is enough to ruin her, legally speaking. Not yet, I said. Not until I've built every layer of protection. Then we'll bring it down at once. He looked at me for a long moment. You've already started, haven't you? I gave a small nod. The blueprints are already on my desk. He raised his glass slightly. Then let's finish the damn thing. That night after Dax left, I walked out to the edge of my property. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of magnolia and night rain. I stared up at the windows of my house, the home I'd built, paid for, protected, and made a silent promise. I would reclaim my family's name, not through vengeance, but through design. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't chase. I would build, because that's what builders do. I went back inside, turned off the lights, and whispered to the darkness. They wanted to teach me shame. I'll teach them permanence. The morning after Dax's visit, the house was unnaturally still. I woke before sunrise, long before the world began to stir, and for a moment I just sat at the edge of the bed, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Silence had always been my ally in business. It let me think. But now, it pressed against me like weight. I made coffee and carried it to the study. The scent filled the room as I unlocked the safe again. The folder from Levante lay inside, along with my notes from the night before. I spread everything across the desk pages, overlapping like the blueprint of a war. The photographs of Elaine and Lila stared up at me, evidence of deceit printed in perfect clarity. I began with the numbers. Money tells stories that words can't hide. Lila's bank records showed deposits from Wells Consulting in neat monthly patterns, always just under the reporting threshold that would draw attention. Elaine had learned from me, I thought grimly. She'd sat beside me through decades of corporate audits. She knew exactly how much was almost invisible. But she had made one mistake. She believed I'd grown too sentimental to see patterns anymore. By 8 o'clock, I was already dressed in a navy suit, crisp white shirt, no tie. I looked at my reflection in the mirror before leaving the house. The man staring back wasn't angry. He looked calm, almost surgical. The face of someone who'd finally remembered who he was. At 9 sharp, I parked outside Gordon Hale's downtown office. The building's glass facade reflected the city's pale morning light, fractured and sharp. I used to like this part of town, clean lines, clean deals. Today it felt like neutral territory. Gordon was already waiting for me in his conference room, a folder labeled Asset Restructuring. Miles Holdings spread out before him. He stood as I entered. "You look better," he said. "I feel worse," I replied, taking my seat. "Let's get started." He slid several documents toward me. I drafted preliminary protections. "We'll transfer majority ownership of your company into a living trust. You'll retain voting control until your death, but the assets themselves become legally shielded. Any outside influence, spouse, child, ex-partner, becomes irrelevant." I scanned the documents, each paragraph like armor. "And the will ready for revision. We can revoke the old one today." I nodded slowly. "Do it." As Gordon read through the clauses aloud, I felt something unfamiliar relief. It wasn't joy. It was the feeling of fortifying a house against a storm already blowing. When we finished, Gordon looked at me carefully. "Howard, are you sure you want to move forward before speaking to Daniel? Once this is filed, there's no quiet way back." I closed the folder and met his gaze. "When my son is ready for truth, he'll find me. But I'm done waiting for permission to protect what's mine." He gave a slow nod. "Then I'll witness the signature myself." I signed each page deliberately, the pen scratching steady across the paper. It felt like sealing a chapter, not ending it, but defining its boundaries. When I left his office, the sun was higher, burning through the last of the morning haze. I walked the block to a nearby cafe and sat by the window. The world outside looked normal, people on phones, traffic lights changing, a mother dragging her child by the hand. But I knew that somewhere inside, that hum of ordinary lifelines were being redrawn. My phone buzzed. A message from Dax, "Call me when you can. I've been thinking about another layer of protection." I called him immediately. "What did you find? Remember that storage account in Savannah from years ago," he said. "You kept corporate archives there, contracts, audits, insurance certificates. We can move the originals of your business licenses and patents there under a new trust name. That way, even if someone files suit, they can't claim direct ownership over the documentation." "Good," I said. "Do it." Quietly. "Already in motion," he replied. "But you'll need to sign authorization for access. I'll drive down tomorrow." After I hung up, I finished my coffee and sat for a while watching the world through the glass. Every betrayal leaves a scar, but this one had awakened an old version of me I'd thought was gone, the builder, the strategist, the man who always planned 5 moves ahead. That afternoon, I returned home and began reorganizing my office. The walls were lined with framed photographs, company awards, newspaper articles, moments of triumph. One by one, I took them down. They were relics of a life that had depended on recognition, not resilience. In their place, I pinned copies of architectural sketches, designs I'd drawn decades ago, when Miles Imports was still an idea. One sketch in particular caught my eye, a half-finished floor plan labeled Project Integrity. It had never been built abandoned for more profitable ventures. I pinned it dead center on the wall. That evening, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I found Anna standing there, raincoat over her shoulders, eyes tired. "Dad," she said quietly. "Anna." I stepped aside. "Come in." She hesitated on the threshold. "I shouldn't be here. Daniel told me not to." Then, "I'm glad you ignored him," I said. We sat in the living room. She stared at her hands for a long time before speaking. "Mom's been acting strange," she began. "She's always on the phone whispering. When I ask who she's talking to, she changes the subject. Last week I heard her say your name. And Lila's." My pulse slowed. "What did she say exactly?" She said, "He'll regret underestimating me. Once the papers are done, Daniel won't need him at all." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "The papers," I repeated. Anna nodded. I think she meant legal ones. Something about transferring authority. I exhaled slowly. "Thank you for telling me." Her eyes filled with worry. "Dad, what's going on? Why is everyone lying to each other?" I looked at her, the daughter who had once clung to my arm during thunderstorms, now caught in one of her own. "Because some people mistake control for love," I said quietly. "And others confuse obedience with loyalty." She blinked back tears. "Can you fix it?" "I intend to," I said. "But you can't tell anyone you were here. Not Daniel, not your mother. Promise me." She nodded reluctantly. "I promise." When she left, the night air was heavy with the smell of rain again. I stood at the doorway long after her car disappeared down the street. The magnolia trees were trembling in the wind, their white petals falling one by one. Inside, I returned to the study, opened my notebook, and wrote in careful, deliberate script, Phase 3 exposure. Objective: bring the truth to light on my own terms. I underlined it twice. Then I leaned back in the chair, listening to the thunder roll in the distance. I had spent a lifetime designing structures that could survive storms. This time, the foundation was my family. And I intended to rebuild it, no matter who tried to tear it down. The next morning, I woke before the alarm. The air in my room felt heavy charged. I sat up slowly, staring at the faint gray light slipping through the curtains. The house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. Every instinct I had, the same ones that had built a company from nothing, was awake now, sharp as it had been in my 30s. I went downstairs, poured black coffee, and opened the folder from Gordon again. My signature looked foreign to me. It had always meant confidence, authority, control. Now it meant distance from my son, from my past, from everything I thought family was supposed to be. As I reviewed the legal amendments, a knock echoed at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone this early. When I opened it, Dax was standing there, jacket over his arm, his usual grin gone. "Morning," he said. "Come in." He stepped inside, water dripping from his shoes. "I drove up from Savannah at dawn. You need to see this." He handed me a brown envelope sealed with a strip of clear tape. "It's from Levante. The expanded report you requested." My pulse quickened. I closed the door behind us and led him to the study. He sat while I carefully peeled open the envelope and unfolded the documents inside. The report began with a timeline, dates, phone records, transactions, all cross-referenced with photographs. I flipped to the second page, and there it was, a list of meetings between Elaine and Lila, spanning 14 months before Daniel had ever mentioned her name. "This isn't just coordination," I murmured. "It's a campaign." Dax leaned back. They weren't improvising, Howard. They were engineering. I stared at one photo, a shot taken from across a restaurant patio. Elaine leaned forward over the table, her hand resting on Lila's wrist, her face lit by the same false gentleness I once thought was compassion. The caption read, "May 12th, 2022, the Vintner's Cellar, North Georgia." That date hit me like a hammer. "I was there that weekend," I said. "With you. We went to visit your cousin's vineyard." Dax frowned. "You're right. You went to the restroom that day. When you came back, I told you I saw Elaine with a young woman. You said she was probably with a friend." I closed my eyes for a moment. So that was the first time. I turned another page. A note from the investigator. Subjects visited the office of Notary Public J.R. Whitmore, June 2022. Duration 1 hour 10 minutes. Purpose of appointment unknown. Records sealed under client confidentiality. A notary. That meant a legal document. Power of attorney maybe, or property authorization. Something binding. Something planned. I set the papers down and looked at Dax. "We need to know what they signed." He nodded. "I can file a discovery request through Hale's office. It'll take time." "Do it quietly," I said. "No noise, no leaks." He leaned forward. "Howard, this is already a legal minefield. If Elaine used alimony or joint assets to fund any of this, it's fraud. But if Daniel's name appears anywhere on those documents, it becomes more than fraud. It becomes betrayal." I met his eyes. "Then let's find out which one it is." After he left, I stood by the window, watching the morning light filter through the magnolia branches. My hands rested on the cold glass. The reflection staring back at me wasn't a victim. It was an architect at the beginning of his next project. By noon, Gordon called. "The restructuring documents are complete," he said. "Your company is now fully owned by the Miles Trust. You have full executive control, but no individual can access or transfer ownership, not even your heirs, without your written approval. And if I die, control passes to your designated trustee. Dax." "Already filed." I exhaled. "Then it's done." Howard, Gordon said softly, "This isn't just protection anymore. It's separation. You're cutting your son off." "No," I said, voice firm. "I'm cutting off the people whispering in his ear." That night I sat in the living room with the lights off. The house felt larger than usual. The silence had an edge, but it wasn't loneliness, it was strategy. I replayed every conversation with Daniel over the past year, listening now not as a father, but as a detective. The signs had been there. His nervous laughter, his defensiveness whenever Lila's name came up. The sudden shift from affection to avoidance. Elaine had planted something in him. Doubt, maybe resentment, and it had taken root. I didn't blame him. Not yet. But when the time came, he'd have to face what he'd allowed. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Stop digging. No name, no punctuation. Just that." I stared at it for a long time. My first impulse was anger. My second was curiosity. Fear has a handwriting all its own, and whoever sent that message had plenty of it. I typed one reply. "You should have built stronger walls." Then I blocked the number. The next morning, I drove to the storage facility in Savannah. The air smelled of salt and rain, the sky pale blue above the docks. Inside the private vault, I opened the steel drawers where 30 years of records lay neatly cataloged. I pulled out everything with Elaine's name, every contract she'd ever co-signed, every account she'd touched. I stacked the files in the trunk of my car. Back at home, I spent hours scanning them, labeling each folder, cross-referencing with Levante's report. Patterns began to form, small inconsistencies in her consulting firm's expenses withdrawals that aligned with Lila's deposits. It wasn't just a web anymore. It was a blueprint, one I could finally read. By evening, I called Dax again. "I've found enough," I said. "Now I need you and Gordon to prepare the paperwork for the next step." "What's next?" I looked at the stack of files beside me, the evidence of a 2-year manipulation built in plain sight. "Retribution," I said quietly. "Measured and legal." After I hung up, I went to the balcony and looked out across the quiet neighborhood. The sky was turning crimson. I remembered Daniel as a boy, running across the yard, his laughter echoing through summer light. It struck me then how betrayal never comes from strangers. Only those you feed have the chance to starve you later. I whispered to the evening air, "You'll see soon enough, son. You'll understand what real foundations look like." Inside, I gathered the documents into a single binder. On the cover, I wrote in black ink the Miles Restoration Project. Then I closed it, turned off the lights, and stood in the quiet room for a long time. I wasn't rebuilding for revenge. I was rebuilding to remind them that I'd been the architect all along. By the end of that week, my house no longer felt like a home. It felt like headquarters. Every surface of my study was covered with folders, legal drafts, and notes written in my handwriting. I didn't eat much. I slept even less. I'd spent my entire life designing systems to endure the storms of business. But now I was designing something far more complicated, the dismantling of a lie built inside my own family. On Monday morning, Gordon arrived with a briefcase full of documents. Dax followed 20 minutes later. The three of us sat around the oak table where I used to host holiday dinners. There were no meals today, just signatures and facts. "Everything's ready," Gordon said, adjusting his glasses. "If we execute these papers today, your corporate restructuring will be complete. No one, not Elaine, not Daniel, not anyone will be able to claim authority over your assets or the company. You'll retain full executive power until you decide otherwise." I nodded. "And the new will," he opened a second folder, "revokes all previous versions. It divides your estate equally between your 2 children only if they are not involved in any form of fraud, coercion, or undue influence against you. If they are, the inheritance passes to the Miles Foundation for public development." "That clause will hold up?" "Absolutely," he said. "We've worded it carefully. Then I'll sign it." As the pen touched the paper, I thought of Daniel's first drawing, the crooked sketch of our old house he'd made when he was 7. Back then, I'd hung it on my office wall and told everyone that my son would someday design skyscrapers. He hadn't. Instead, he'd let someone else draw his life for him. I signed the last page, placed the pen down, and looked up at them. "It's done." Dax leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "You've just made yourself bulletproof." I shook my head. "No one's bulletproof, Dax, but I've reinforced the walls." After they left, the house felt oddly still again. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the papers, stacked neatly on the table. Legal protection looked cold on paper, but to me it felt like breathing again. Around noon, I called Levante Investigations. The same steady voice answered. "This is Holloway," I said. "I need verification on the notary visit from June 2022. Full copy of any document registered under either name, Elaine Miles or Lila Carver." "One moment, Mr. Miles." There was the sound of typing. Then the investigator said, "We can't access the files directly without a subpoena, but we've confirmed that a power of attorney document was notarized under both names. The primary beneficiary listed is Daniel Miles." My throat tightened. "A power of attorney?" "Yes, sir. Financial, not medical. Filed June 21st, 2022. That meant Elaine had legally positioned herself to act on Daniel's behalf. With that document, she could influence property transfers, bank authorizations, anything. And Lila had witnessed it. I hung up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the magnolia trees were in bloom again, white petals scattered across the driveway like confetti. I'd once told Daniel that magnolias were symbols of endurance. I wondered now if he remembered. I poured a drink. The bourbon burned less this time. Maybe I was getting used to the taste of betrayal. By 4 in the afternoon, I received another message from Levante Surveillance Extension approved. Subjects contacted each other last night. Meeting scheduled tomorrow evening, 7:30 p.m. at the Foundry Grill. That was the same restaurant Daniel and I had used for Sunday lunches for years. They were meeting there intentionally to erase the memory of what had once been mine. I typed a reply. Observe only. No interference. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I walked through the house instead, each room echoing with a past version of my life. The living room where Daniel had taken his first steps. The staircase where Anna had cried after breaking her arm. The kitchen where Elaine and I had once danced, back when we still believed success could fix everything. I ended up in my study again. On the wall hung a photograph from 20 years ago, the three of us standing in front of my company's first warehouse. My arm around Elaine, Daniel holding my hand. We were all smiling. I didn't remember the photographer's name anymore, but I remembered what I'd felt that day, invincible. Now as I looked at it, I saw it differently. Elaine's eyes weren't smiling. They were calculating. Maybe they always had been. I took the photo down, placed it face down on the desk, and turned off the lamp. The house fell into darkness, except for the moonlight filtering through the window. The next morning, I received an email from Levante. Attached was a photo from the surveillance at the Foundry Grill. The image was grainy, but clear enough. Elaine and Lila seated at a corner booth, heads close together. Between them lay a manila envelope. The timestamp read 7:48 p.m. I zoomed in, heart pounding slowly but hard. On the back of the envelope, written in blue ink, was Daniel's name. For several seconds, I couldn't move. It wasn't shock anymore. It was confirmation. The kind of confirmation that doesn't wound, but solidifies. I called Dax immediately. It's worse than we thought. He didn't ask what I meant. Tell me. They met last night. Elaine had a document with Daniel's name on it. I don't know what it was yet, but it's enough for me to act. What's your move? Preparation phase is over, I said. We go to legal action. Fraud, manipulation, misuse of alimony, everything. File it discreetly, but fast. He paused. Howard, once this goes public, there's no coming back. There's nothing to go back to, I said quietly. After the call, I went out onto the porch. The air was thick with humidity, the sky glowing faintly before sunset. I thought of Daniel again, his first promotion, the way he'd called me that night, his voice bright with pride. You were right, Dad. Patience pays off. Patience. That was the word that had defined my life. And now patience had run its course. I finished my drink, set the glass on the railing, and whispered to the evening air, You wanted to play Architect Elaine. Let's see how well your house stands when the ground gives way. Inside, I opened my notebook and wrote the final words under Phase 3 exposure. Objective initiated. Legal action begins. Silence continues until conclusion. Then I closed the book, turned off the light, and let the darkness fold around me. For the first time since that night outside the ballroom, I felt no humiliation, no anger, only precision. The kind of precision that builds legacies or destroys them. And I was done building for anyone else. The morning of the gala broke clear and blue, the kind of sky that looked painted rather than real. I hadn't planned to attend at first. The event was one of those charity evenings Daniel loved to use for networking. The Magnolia Estate rented out for its marble chandeliers and its air of old Southern prestige. I had signed the final purchase documents a week earlier. The building was mine now, quietly and legally, though no one outside my team knew. By the time the first trucks arrived to unload flowers and equipment, I was already there. The security team nodded when I entered through the side door. The ballroom was empty and quiet sunlight spilling through the tall windows onto the polished floor. I ran my hand along the banister as I climbed the staircase to the balcony. The air smelled of lilies and fresh paint. It was the same hall where months before I'd been turned away like a stranger. Now I owned it. Carmen met me near the upper corridor. "Everything's in place, Mr. Miles. The vendors are setting up and the staff has been briefed. No one knows about the ownership transfer." "Good," I said. "Let's keep it that way." She hesitated. "Would you like me to stay nearby during the event?" I smiled slightly. "No. This evening belongs to them. I'm just here to observe." She nodded and left to manage the final preparations. By mid-afternoon, the ballroom was transformed. Gold drapes shimmered in the light tables dressed in white and ivory candles lined up like soldiers. I stood at the same spot near the entrance where the guards had once blocked my way. The memory played like a film in reverse, the laughter, the cold faces, the feeling of being erased. I let it pass through me without bitterness. I was no longer the man on the sidewalk. At 5:30, the first guests began to arrive. Limousines and luxury sedans rolled up the circular drive. Familiar faces emerged, people who had looked away that night. They didn't recognize me now, standing quietly among the staff in a simple black suit. Then I saw them, Elaine radiant in silver, her hand resting lightly on Lila's arm. They walked into the ballroom as if they owned it. Behind them came Daniel, smiling tightly, shaking hands, pretending everything was fine. For a moment, I almost pitied him. He had no idea how fragile his stage really was. I stayed out of sight until 7 o'clock when the band started playing and the evening officially began. The crowd gathered near the center of the ballroom as Lila took the stage. "Good evening, everyone," she said into the microphone. "Thank you for joining us at the Magnolia Estate for this incredible night of giving and celebration." I leaned against the balcony rail above, looking down at her. Her confidence was impeccable, controlled, polished, rehearsed. Elaine stood nearby, hands clasped, smiling like a woman watching her plan reach completion. When Daniel joined her on stage, applause filled the room. He thanked the sponsors, made a few predictable jokes, and gestured toward Elaine and Lila. None of this would have been possible without the vision of two extraordinary women, my wife and my mother. The audience cheered. Cameras flashed. My stomach twisted not from jealousy, but from the sheer audacity of the moment. Carmen appeared beside me, whispering, "Everything's ready when you are." "Good," I said. "Cue the announcement." She nodded to the technician at the booth. Seconds later, the lights dimmed slightly, and the MC's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue this beautiful evening, we have a very special acknowledgement. Please welcome to the stage the new principal benefactor and owner of the Magnolia Estate, Mr. Howard Miles." For a moment, the room went completely still. Every head turned, every camera shifted. Elaine's smile froze. Lila's hand tightened around the microphone. Daniel blinked, disbelief washing over his face like cold water. I stepped out from the balcony and began descending the staircase slowly, one measured step at a time. The light from the chandelier caught the edges of my suit. Conversations turned to murmurs, then to silence. When I reached the floor, I took a glass of champagne from a stunned waiter and faced the crowd. "Good evening," I said calmly, my voice carrying through the room. It's wonderful to see this hall so alive again. The Magnolia Estate has a long history, one that includes a few complicated evenings. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the audience. Some of you may remember one such evening, I continued. A wedding, a father at the door, a misunderstanding that became a spectacle. Daniel's face went pale. Elaine's hand gripped the back of a chair. I raised the glass slightly. Tonight I stand here not to revisit the past, but to clarify it. I bought this estate last week. The contracts are signed, sealed, and filed. As of this morning, the Magnolia belongs to the Miles Trust. Gasps filled the room. Someone at the back whispered my name. Lila tried to regain composure. That's wonderful news, Mr. Miles, she said into the microphone. We're honored to host tonight's event here under your ownership. I smiled faintly. I'm sure you are. You see, I have always believed in poetic symmetry. The last time I stood outside those doors, I wasn't allowed to enter. Tonight I opened them myself. The room went silent again. The moment stretched. Cameras flashed like lightning. Elaine looked as though she might faint. Daniel took a hesitant step forward. Dad, he said quietly, maybe we should. I met his eyes. No need, Daniel. Everything's fine. Enjoy your evening. I simply came to make sure everyone knows the foundation they're standing on. I handed the microphone back to Lila and nodded to Carmen. The lights dimmed slightly as the music resumed. People began to move again, though their smiles were thinner now, their laughter forced. As I turned to leave, Elaine's voice reached me soft but shaking. You planned this? I stopped, looked over my shoulder, and said, I execute plans. Others create them. Then I walked out through the same doors that had once been shut against me. Outside, the night air was cool, the magnolia trees swaying gently in the breeze. The sound of distant music drifted through the open windows, blending with laughter that no longer reached me. Carmen followed me to the car. That was something, sir. It was necessary, I said. They needed to see the ground shift. She hesitated. What happens now? I looked up at the glowing windows. Now, I said, the storm starts for them. I got into the car, closed the door, and drove away slowly down the winding drive. The ballroom lights receded in the rearview mirror until they looked like stars, bright, unreachable, already fading. And for the first time since that night in the rain, I felt something close to peace. Not revenge, not victory. Just balance returning to the architecture of my life. The morning after the gala felt almost unreal. The headlines came first, my name printed in bold letters across half a dozen business columns. Businessman Howard Miles reclaims venue in poetic turn. Beneath it, a photograph caught me mid-speech, champagne glass in hand, face calm, while the crowd behind me looked stunned. The image had already gone viral. I sat in my kitchen robe, still on coffee, growing cold beside the paper. I read the words once, then folded the page carefully and set it aside. I'd spent a lifetime in boardrooms learning that public reaction means nothing if the foundation beneath it isn't solid. What mattered wasn't the noise, it was the silence that followed. My phone buzzed on the table. Gordon. Howard, he said the moment I answered. I assume you've seen the news. I have, I said. It was inevitable. I'll admit, he continued, it's not every day I watch a man announce ownership of an entire estate in front of the very people who once humiliated him. It wasn't for spectacle, I replied. It was for symmetry. Gordon chuckled softly. Well, your symmetry has consequences. I've already received calls from 2 of Elaine's lawyers. They're in panic mode. They want to know if your acquisition affects their ongoing agreements. Tell them yes, I said. It affects everything. And Lila, she'll find out soon enough. I ended the call and leaned back in my chair, staring out the window. The magnolia trees glistened with dew sunlight dancing on their leaves. The house was quiet again, so quiet it reminded me of the hours after my divorce, when silence wasn't peace, but aftermath. At noon, I drove downtown to meet Gordon and Logan Reeves, the young associate who had helped compile the investigation data. The three of us sat in Gordon's glass-walled office papers, spread across the table like a map of a war we'd already won, but hadn't finished fighting. Logan was the first to speak. "Mr. Miles, we've completed the tracing of Wells Consulting's financials. Your ex-wife moved alimony funds through 3 shell companies. 2 of those were linked to Pierce Carver Associates, your daughter-in-law's firm. We can file charges for misuse of court-ordered support, corporate fraud, and conspiracy to defraud." "Do it," I said. Gordon nodded. "We'll file the suit quietly at first. Once it's accepted, it becomes public record. That'll hit them harder than any speech," I smiled faintly. Truth always does. We spent the next hour finalizing signatures and paperwork. When it was over, I stood, straightened my jacket, and looked out the window at the city skyline, Atlanta shimmering beneath an afternoon haze. My reflection looked older, but grounded. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was finishing. On my way out, Gordon walked beside me. "You could let this rest, Howard. You've already won." I shook my head. "Winning isn't the point. Stability is. If I don't close every loophole, they'll crawl through one eventually." He sighed, but didn't argue. That evening, as I pulled into my driveway, Carmen was waiting near the gate. She'd never come to the house unannounced before. "Sorry, sir," she said quickly. "I wouldn't bother you, but something happened this morning at the estate." What happened? Elaine showed up. She was furious. She demanded a meeting with the management. I told her she'd have to go through your office. She called you Carmen, hesitated, an ungrateful fraud. I laughed quietly. "That's new." "She's unraveling," Carmen said. Her face. She looked lost. "Desperation looks like that," I said. "Thank you for keeping your composure." "Of course, sir," she said. But she didn't come alone. Lila was with her. That made me pause, and Daniel know. Just the 2 of them. They were arguing before they even got out of the car. I nodded slowly. "Then the cracks are showing." When she left, I stayed outside for a while, the evening air warm against my face. Crickets had begun their quiet chorus, and the magnolias swayed gently in the dusk. Somewhere inside me, a strange calm began to form. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but distance. Later that night, I poured a drink and sat at my desk. My phone buzzed again, another text, this time from Dax. Elaine's attorney reached out. "They're trying to negotiate a private settlement before you file." I typed my reply slowly. No negotiation, no settlement. Let the record speak. I set the phone aside. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window. Same face, new clarity. The next morning, I woke to another message from Gordon. "Filing completed. Case number assigned. You'll be notified when the court date is set." It was done. I dressed, made coffee, and drove to the estate. The staff greeted me with smiles, the kind that came from genuine respect rather than obligation. The ballroom looked different in daylight, soft, elegant, quiet. Carmen met me at the stairs. 3 new events booked this week, she said proudly. People are calling the magnolia a symbol of new beginnings. I smiled. Good. Let it keep that energy. As I turned to leave, she said, "Mr. Miles, if you don't mind me asking, why did you buy this place?" "Really?" I looked at her. "Because they tried to make it a monument to my humiliation. Now, it's a monument to recovery." She nodded thoughtfully. "Then, I think you've already won." I didn't answer. I just walked through the ballroom, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. That night when I returned home, the house felt lighter. I opened my notebook, flipped to the last page, and wrote in bold ink, Phase 4 Justice. Initiated. Then I set the pen down and turned off the lamp. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the horizon, slow and deliberate. I listened to it for a long time before speaking softly into the dark. They thought they could take what I built, I said. But you can't steal structure from its architect. The storm moved closer, rain tapping gently against the windows. I didn't mind the sound. For me, rain no longer meant shame, it meant cleansing. I closed my eyes and whispered one last sentence before sleep claimed me. Tomorrow the noise will start again. But I'll be the only one who knows. It's already over. The first sign that the lawsuit had hit came on a Thursday morning when my phone lit up with messages, voicemails from Gordon, Dax, even Carmen. By the time I got to my desk, the news was already circulating online. One headline stood out, Elaine Wells Miles sued for fraud and conspiracy by ex-husband. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, the words oddly quiet in my mind. There was no rush of victory, no thrill, just confirmation. The phone rang again. Gordon, Howard, he said, his tone brisk but measured. It's out. The court clerk released the filing earlier than expected. The press got it immediately. I figured they would. Elaine's lawyers are panicking. They've filed for an emergency injunction to seal the financial details, but it's too late. The case summary is public. Everyone knows. And Lila? He hesitated. She's been named as a co-conspirator. Her firm's website went down this morning. I'd expect her to reach out soon. Let her, I said quietly. But I won't answer. When we hung up, I poured a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the back porch. The air was still heavy with the scent of the magnolias. Somewhere across the neighborhood, a lawnmower droned faintly. A reminder that life always continues, even when yours feels paused. I stood there a long while, watching sunlight spill over the yard. For the first time in months, I didn't feel trapped by the past. Everything was finally in motion, and all I had to do was let the truth work. By noon, Dax arrived. His tie was loose, his sleeves rolled up. Well, he said, dropping his briefcase on the table, you've officially rattled the entire Wells Miles ecosystem. That was the point, I said. He opened the case and pulled out a folder. The court's already assigned a hearing date, August 14th. Vivian's, he caught himself. Elaine's side will probably request a delay, but the judge isn't known for leniency. You'll need to testify. I'll be ready. He sat down, scanning his notes. You know, I've represented you for 20 years. I've seen you close multi-million-dollar deals without blinking. But this is different. You're not just defending assets now. You're defining legacy. I met his gaze. Maybe they're the same thing. He gave a slow nod. Maybe. Before he left, he set another envelope on the table. You might want to look at this, he said. It's from Anna. After he drove off, I stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter, her delicate cursive, instantly recognizable. Dad, I don't know if you'll want to hear from me right now, but I need to tell you something before it's too late. I went to see Daniel yesterday. He's angry, confused, defensive, but he's starting to see cracks in their story. He found messages between Mom and Lila from before he even met her. He didn't tell me what they said, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He knows deep down that you were right. He asked if you hate him. I didn't know how to answer. Please, Dad, whatever happens next, don't let this destroy him completely. You may have to take everything, but if there's a way to leave him a path back to you, even a narrow one, I hope you'll keep it open. Love, Anna. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside my notebook. Her words didn't change anything yet, but they reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. Compassion doesn't weaken structure, it strengthens it. That night I couldn't sleep. The rain started around midnight, steady and rhythmic. I sat by the window with a glass of bourbon, watching the droplets slide down the glass. My reflection looked older under the dim light, but my eyes were steady. At 2 a.m, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Howard. A familiar voice said. It was Daniel. I didn't speak. Dad, please, don't hang up. I waited. I saw the papers, he said. The lawsuit, the trust, the estate, everything. I didn't know it had gone that far. You didn't know, I repeated softly. Or you didn't want to. Silence. Then quietly, both. I leaned back in the chair. You've always had intelligence, Daniel, but intelligence without integrity is just calculation. I know, he said, voice cracking. I made a mistake. A lot of them. But I didn't know what Mom and Lila were doing. I swear to you I didn't. And yet I said you enforced their choices. You didn't have to throw me out of that ballroom to prove loyalty. I thought I was protecting peace, he said. I thought you were trying to sabotage the wedding. And now? He exhaled shakily. Now I know who was sabotaging who. The silence between us was long, but not as sharp as before. What do you want, Daniel? I asked finally. I don't want money, he said quickly. Not anymore. I just want to talk, face to face. No lawyers, no documents. I hesitated. Every part of me wanted to tell him no. But there was something in his voice, something I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, apologizing after his first real mistake. Tomorrow, I said finally. 4 o'clock. Centennial Park near the fountain. Just you. I'll be there. When I hung up, I stared at the dark screen for a long time. The rain had stopped. The quiet that followed was heavier than before, but not suffocating. The next day, I arrived early. The park was half empty, the air still damp from the storm. Children played near the fountain, their laughter bright against the gray sky. I sat on a bench overlooking the water and waited. At 4:03, Daniel appeared. He looked thinner, his posture uncertain. When he saw me, he stopped, took a deep breath, and approached slowly. Dad, I nodded toward the bench. Sit. He did. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, I saw the emails. The transfers. Everything. Lila and Mom were planning it for months. You were right. I studied his face. So what now? He looked down at his hands. Lila's gone. She left 2 days ago. No note, no call. Just disappeared. Mom keeps calling me, but I can't even look at her. And you think this changes anything? No, he said quietly. It doesn't erase what I did. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know I'm not blind anymore. I watched the fountain spray shimmer in the air between us. You believed lies because they were easier than truth. That's your burden to carry. He nodded slowly. I'll carry it. But Dad, if there's still a way to earn your trust again someday. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at him, the boy I'd raised, the man he'd become, the stranger sitting beside me. Finally, I said, trust isn't a bridge you rebuild overnight. It's a foundation you pour slowly, one truth at a time. If you mean what you're saying, start there. He swallowed hard. I will. We sat in silence for a few more minutes. Then he stood, nodded once, and walked away, shoulders heavy but steps steady. When he was gone, I sat there a while longer, the wind moving softly through the trees. I didn't feel closure, not yet, but something quieter. A beginning, perhaps. By the time I got home, the sun had set. The house felt different that night, not empty, but waiting. I poured another drink, sat at my desk, and wrote in my notebook, Phase 5 Reconstruction, Foundation Pending. Then I closed it, turned off the lamp and whispered to the dark one truth at a time. The day after meeting Daniel, I felt a kind of quiet exhaustion I hadn't known before, not the fatigue of work or grief, but the strange emptiness that comes when you finally stop running toward revenge. For months, my mind had been a machine building, documenting, protecting. Now it was still. I woke early and walked through the house barefoot, coffee in hand. The air smelled like rain and lemon polish. Every room carried its ghosts, the laughter that once filled the kitchen, the echo of small feet on the stairs, the sound of a family that no longer existed. But the ghosts didn't hurt anymore. They simply reminded me of what had been built before the cracks appeared. At 9, the doorbell rang. Dax stood outside holding a briefcase and a box of files. "Morning," he said, smiling faintly. "I hope you've slept better than I have." "I haven't," I said. "Come in." We sat in the study where the late morning sun cut across the desk in bright slats of gold. He opened the box and slid a thick file toward me. "The hearing's set for next week," he said. "Elaine's legal team is trying to claim emotional distress and reputational damage. They want to settle before testimony." "Settlement implies compromise," I said. "I'm not compromising truth." He nodded, expected that answer. "Good, then you should see this." He handed me a printed statement. Elaine's lawyer plans to argue that the power of attorney she and Lila filed was symbolic, that it never transferred control of any real assets. I read the paragraph twice, then looked up. Symbolic, yes. They'll claim it was merely a gesture of trust between mother and son. I laughed quietly. "A gesture worth $7 million, he smiled grimly. "I've prepared documentation to counter it, bank transfers, email correspondences, even timestamps of meetings between Elaine and Lila before Daniel ever met her. Legally, we're impenetrable, but you should be ready for emotional tactics in court. They'll try to paint you as cold, vindictive. Then I'll tell the truth," I said simply. Vindictiveness doesn't document timestamps. We worked for 3 hours revising testimony, cross-checking evidence, assembling the kind of airtight case that leaves no space for manipulation. When he finally closed his folder, he looked up at me. "Howard," he said quietly, "you've built something remarkable here, an unbreakable fortress, but don't forget that fortresses also isolate the builder." I looked at him, realizing there was affection in his voice, not warning. "I'm aware," I said softly, "but you can't rebuild until you've stopped the flood." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll see you in court." After he left, the house was silent again. I stood by the window watching the magnolia petals drift lazily across the yard. A thought came to me, uninvited, stubborn. Maybe the storm is already passing. That afternoon, I received a text from Anna. "Daniel told me he met with you. Thank you for giving him that chance. He's quieter now, thoughtful, different." I typed a brief reply. Everyone changes when the truth stops whispering and starts echoing. Later, I drove to the Magnolia estate. It had become something of a ritual now, a place to think, not to gloat. Carmen greeted me at the entrance, clipboard in hand. "Everything's running smoothly," she said. "No sign of Mrs. Wells or her entourage?" "Good," I said. "Keep it that way." She smiled. "We've had 4 new wedding bookings this month. I suppose people love the idea of a place that survived a scandal." I chuckled. "They always do. People are drawn to redemption stories, even when they don't know who the redemption belongs to." I walked the ballroom floor slowly. The chandeliers shimmered above me, their light scattering in perfect order. It struck me again, the strange symmetry of life. I'd been thrown out of this building as a father. I'd returned to it as its owner. And now I walked through it not as either, but as a man who had simply endured. I stood at the spot near the door where the guards once blocked my way. I could almost see them still their rigid posture, the way one of them held up the photograph of me as if I were a threat. I remembered how it felt, the laughter, the humiliation, the rain soaking through my suit. But now there was only stillness. "You did what you were told," I whispered to their ghosts. "I did what I had to." When I got back home, the sun was setting. The sky was a soft orange wash fading to violet. I poured myself a drink, sat in the armchair by the window, and opened my notebook to a fresh page. Phase 6, Consequences. Ongoing. As I wrote, my phone rang again, unknown number. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mr. Miles." The voice was female, tight, nervous. "Yes. This is Sarah Pierce. I used to work for Pierce Carver Associates. Lila's company. I think you should know," she continued. "Ms. Carver's been moving money out of the business since last week. Personal accounts, offshore transfers, crypto, small amounts, but frequent. She's leaving, where I don't know yet. But she booked a one-way ticket to Dubai." I leaned back in my chair. "Thank you, Ms. Pierce. You did the right thing calling me." After we hung up, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. It didn't surprise me. Lila had always been the type to run when the ground started shaking. But it wasn't fear that filled me, it was finality. People like her always think they can outrun truth. They forget that truth travels quietly, but never stops. That night I walked outside barefoot, letting the cool grass soak under my feet. The air smelled of earth and rain. I looked up at the sky, thick clouds, faint moonlight. Somewhere out there, Daniel was probably trying to pick up the pieces of a life built on illusions. Elaine was facing her own reflection in court. Lila was running toward a horizon she'd never reach. And me, I was finally standing still. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man fighting back. I felt like a man reclaiming his breath. I whispered to the night, "Whatever comes next, it will be built clean." And with that, I went back inside, closed the door gently, and left the past outside where it belonged. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and old air conditioning, the scent of battles fought in silence. I arrived early that morning, dressed in a charcoal suit, the same color I'd worn the night I was barred from my son's wedding. This time I chose it intentionally. It wasn't mourning, it was symmetry. Dax met me at the entrance. He carried 2 briefcases, his face unreadable. "Elaine's already inside," he said. "She brought a full legal team. Lila didn't show." "She never does when accountability's involved," I said. We entered the courtroom together. Elaine sat at the far table, surrounded by attorneys. She looked smaller than I remembered, but her expression was defiant. Her silver hair was pulled tightly back. Her hands clasped neatly on the table. When her eyes met mine, they didn't flicker. For a second, it felt like we were back in mediation, 10 years ago, arguing over property and alimony. Only this time, I wasn't defending what I'd built. I was reclaiming what she'd corrupted. The judge entered and the room rose. When we sat, the world outside disappeared. Her lead attorney, a man named Keaton, stood first. "Your Honor, my client has endured sustained defamation and emotional distress due to a series of unfounded allegations orchestrated by her former husband, Mr. Howard Miles. We intend to prove that the power of attorney in question was never exercised and that the funds in question were personal, not alimony." Dax rose immediately. "Your Honor, we have documented evidence of direct financial transfers from Mrs. Wells Miles's account, funds derived from court-ordered alimony to Pierce Carver Associates, co-owned by her daughter-in-law. These transactions occurred prior to her son's marriage to Ms. Carver, and during an ongoing relationship between both women established through independent investigation." Keaton interrupted. "Conjecture. Evidence," Dax said sharply, sliding a folder across the bench. The judge took his time reviewing it. When he looked up, his expression was neutral, but not indifferent. Continue, Mr. Evans. For the next 2 hours, Dax presented everything: photographs, phone records, meeting logs, even the notarized document from June 2022. He spoke clearly, his tone calm but surgical. Each fact landed like a chisel against marble, cutting through the story Elaine's team had built. When he finished, it was her turn. Keaton leaned forward, lowering his voice for effect. Mrs. Miles, can you tell the court in your own words why you filed that power of attorney? Elaine took a breath. Because my son trusted me, she said. We'd been rebuilding our relationship, and he wanted to ensure I could help manage some of his finances while he was planning his wedding. It was symbolic, nothing more. And did you ever use that document to access any of Mr. Howard Miles's assets? She shook her head. Of course not. Howard and I may have our differences, but I would never cross that line. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. To anyone else, it might have sounded sincere. To me, it was choreography. I'd once taught her how to use silence as leverage in negotiations. She hadn't forgotten. When Dax cross-examined, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Mrs. Miles, do you recall meeting Ms. Lila Carver on March 22, 2022 at the Mandarin Club Charity Gala? I don't remember. He slid a photo across the stand. This photograph shows you with Ms. Carver that night. Would you like to amend your answer? Her eyes flickered. Perhaps we met briefly. And the following May, when you both visited Notary Public Whitmore's office, was that also brief? She stiffened. That was about a real estate consultation? Dax nodded. And yet no property was ever purchased. But the same week you transferred $15,000 to Pierce Carver Associates. How do you explain that? Her silence filled the room. Finally, she said, that was a gift. A generous one, Dax said smoothly, especially given that your alimony was $15,000 a month. An exact match. The courtroom murmured. Elaine's attorney objected, but the judge overruled. When the session adjourned for lunch, I stepped into the hallway. Reporters waited outside, cameras flashing like lightning. I ignored them and walked to the quiet corridor by the stairwell. For a long moment, I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes. I heard footsteps. Daniel's voice followed. Dad. I turned. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed. I came to support the truth, he said simply. I nodded once. That's all I ever wanted. We stood in silence. Then he said, Mom's unraveling. She's trying to convince herself that she's still the victim. She always did mistake control for love, I said quietly. He looked down. I did too once. Then you've learned. He met my eyes. I'm trying. The afternoon session moved quickly. Elaine's defense faltered under the weight of evidence. Her story collapsed piece by piece. Each contradiction exposed, each justification stripped of credibility. When it was over, the judge set a date for the verdict: 2 weeks. After court, I walked out into the fading sunlight. Daniel followed beside me, saying nothing. When we reached the parking lot, he stopped. Dad, he said, I don't expect you to forgive me yet. But thank you for letting me stand there today, for not shutting me out. I studied him for a long moment. I didn't let you stand there, Daniel. You earned it. By showing up. He nodded, eyes glistening. Then I'll keep showing up. I placed a hand on his shoulder. One truth at a time, son. He left in his car, and I stood there watching the taillights fade into the evening traffic. Back home, the house felt lighter. The walls didn't echo as much. I poured myself a drink and sat in the armchair by the window. The magnolia trees outside swayed in the wind, their white blossoms glowing faintly in the dusk. I opened my notebook, the pages filled with months of strategy, emotion, and reflection. On the last page beneath Phase 6 consequences, I drew a clean line and wrote Phase 7 restoration underway. Then I put the pen down, exhaled slowly, and whispered to the quiet room, "I've stood outside long enough. It's time to go home." 2 weeks later, the courthouse felt different. The sharp edge of tension had dulled into quiet inevitability. I sat in the front row with Dax beside me, both of us waiting for the judge to return with his verdict. Outside, the air was thick with summer heat, the kind that made everything feel slow and heavy. Inside, time seemed to stretch between heartbeats. Elaine sat at her table across the room. Her posture was still proud, but her eyes were tired. The confidence that once dripped from every gesture had been replaced by calculation and fear. Daniel sat behind her, his face unreadable. Anna was next to him, calm but firm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When the judge finally entered, the sound of footsteps echoed through the courtroom, like a metronome. He didn't waste time. After reviewing all presented evidence, financial records, notarized documents, corroborating testimonies, the court finds sufficient proof of fraudulent use of alimony funds, undue influence, and collusion between Mrs. Elaine Wells Miles and Miss Lila Carver. A murmur swept through the room. Elaine stiffened. The court orders restitution of $540,000 plus $160,000 in legal fees to the plaintiff, Mr. Howard Miles. Furthermore, the power of attorney signed in June 2022 is hereby declared null and void. Dax's hand tightened briefly on my arm. I didn't move. I simply nodded once. The judge continued, "Ms. Carver, though absent, will face additional proceedings regarding her business practices. This court recommends federal review for financial misconduct." And then it was over. The gavel struck wood, one sharp sound that ended 2 years of deceit. When I stood, Elaine looked at me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "You destroyed me." I shook my head. "You destroyed yourself." I just turned on the lights. I walked out of that courthouse into a burst of sunlight, so bright it almost hurt. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing questions overlapping Mr. Miles. "How do you feel? Do you plan to reconcile with your family? What happens now?" I didn't answer any of them. I just smiled faintly, got into my car, and drove away. The first place I went wasn't my office. It wasn't even home. I drove to the Magnolia Estate. The afternoon light slanted through the trees, painting long shadows across the marble steps. The staff was setting up for a wedding that evening, white roses, crystal glassware, laughter in the air. Life continuing. Carmen met me at the entrance, clipboard in hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Miles. I heard the news." I smiled. "You hear everything. It's my job," she said, grinning. "Do you want to make any announcements about ownership now that the case is settled?" "No," I said. "Let the building speak for itself. It's been through enough noise." She nodded, and I walked into the ballroom alone. The chandeliers sparkled above light, scattering like 1,000 tiny stars. I stopped at the center of the floor, the same spot where I'd once stood, humiliated in the rain, uninvited, unwanted. Now the silence was mine. I took a slow breath. "Full circle," I whispered. From the balcony above, I heard footsteps. I turned to see Daniel standing there, hesitant. He looked older, more grounded. He made his way down the steps slowly, like a man walking into his own reckoning. "I didn't think you'd come," I said. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "But Anna said you'd be here. I wanted to see it for myself." He looked around the ballroom, his eyes tracing every detail. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "You've restored it." "Not yet," I said. "But it's on its way." He nodded, then took a deep breath. "Dad, I know I can't undo what I did. But I want to rebuild whatever that means, whatever it takes." I studied his face. There was no defiance now, no entitlement. Just humility, the kind that only grows after everything collapses. "Then rebuild," I said simply. "One action at a time." I will." We stood there in silence, sunlight spilling through the tall windows, catching in the dust like gold threads. I thought of how much had been lost and how much still remained. Finally, Daniel looked at me. "You know," he said softly, "I read something about magnolia trees. They bloom even after they've been cut almost to the root. Takes years, but they grow again stronger." I smiled. "Then maybe we're more like those trees than I thought." He nodded. "Maybe we are." When he left, I stayed behind for a while, listening to the faint music of the wedding rehearsal beginning in another hall. The laughter, the piano chords, the low hum of voices. It all washed over me, like the sound of rain after a drought. I didn't feel like a man who'd won anything. I felt like a man who'd finished something and could finally begin again. That night back at home, I sat in my study one last time. I opened my notebook to the final page and wrote in calm, deliberate strokes, Phase 8 renewal. Completed. Then beneath it, some storms don't destroy, they cleanse. Some endings are beginnings, wearing different names. I closed the book, leaned back, and looked out at the dark yard where the magnolias shimmered under moonlight. For the first time in years, the air felt clean. If you're still here listening to my story, thank you. Maybe you've faced your own kind of betrayal, your own storm. Maybe you've stood outside a door that was meant to be yours. If you have, let me tell you, this time and truth are architects. They rebuild everything that was torn apart, slowly, quietly, but completely. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. Share your own story below. Maybe together we can remind each other that even after the rain, life still finds a way to bloom. And if you'd like to hear more stories like mine, real lives' hard lessons, quiet victories, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and stay a while. The next story might just be yours.